When I agreed to bring my fiancé home for dinner with my family, I thought it would be a simple evening filled with laughter, warmth, and maybe a little teasing about our future plans. I had imagined my grandmother's eyes twinkling as she told her endless stories from the past, my father leaning back in his chair with that proud look he always wore whenever I spoke about my life, and my mother fussing over dishes even though she knew everything was already perfect. I never imagined that the night would turn into a disaster so shocking that it would change the way I saw my fiancé forever, a night that ended with flashing lights, sharp words, and the heavy sound of handcuffs closing. It all began so normally, which is perhaps why it felt like the ground opened beneath me when everything collapsed. From the start of the evening, there had been tension I could not quite place. My fiancé, Daniel, had seemed distracted as we walked up the path to my parents' house, his jaw tight, his hand gripping mine in a way that felt more like restraint than affection. I brushed it off, telling myself he was nervous about meeting my grandmother for the first time. She was sharp-tongued, often brutally honest, and not easily impressed by anyone new. Still, I had hoped her kindness would shine through, that she would see what I saw in him, and that the night would end with her approval. We stepped inside, greeted by the familiar warmth of the home I grew up in. My mother's smile lit the room as she pulled me into a hug, her eyes glancing curiously at Daniel before she offered him her hand. He shook it, but I noticed his grip lingered longer than it should, and something in her expression flickered, though she quickly covered it with politeness. My father, ever observant, simply gave Daniel a firm nod, the kind of silent assessment that revealed more than words could. But it was my grandmother who, with her frail frame and steady gaze, seemed to pierce through Daniel in an instant. She was sitting at the head of the table, her cane resting against the chair, her silver hair tied back neatly, and her lips pressed into a thin line. Dinner began with small talk, the clinking of cutlery against plates, and the kind of forced politeness that only deepened the longer it went on. Daniel answered questions about his work, about his family, and about our engagement, but his tone was clipped, his eyes darting between me and my grandmother as though measuring something I could not understand. Every time my grandmother asked him something, he hesitated just slightly, as if calculating his response, and it made the air feel heavier. The twist came when my grandmother, in her blunt way, asked him a question no one else had dared to. "Daniel," she said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of authority, "what is it that you truly want from my granddaughter? Is it her heart, or is it something else?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Daniel's face hardened, and I could feel the heat rise in my cheeks as I waited for him to answer, hoping he would laugh it off or express his love in a way that would disarm her. But instead he snapped. His voice was sharp, cutting through the room like glass shattering. He accused her of being controlling, of meddling in our relationship, of judging him without knowing anything about him. The anger in his tone startled me, but what shocked me more was how quickly it escalated. Before I could process what was happening, Daniel stood, his chair scraping back across the floor, and in a moment that seemed frozen in time, he raised his hand and struck my grandmother across the face. The sound echoed, louder than anything I had ever heard, followed by the sharp intake of breath from my mother and the fury in my father's eyes. My grandmother's head turned with the impact, her cheek reddening instantly, but her expression remained calm, almost defiant, as though she had been expecting it all along. My world tilted on its axis. I could not breathe, could not think, could not believe that the man I thought I loved was capable of something so cruel, so violent, and so unforgivable. My father leapt to his feet, his fists clenched, while my mother screamed Daniel's name in horror. I rushed to my grandmother's side, tears stinging my eyes as I touched her cheek, my voice shaking as I asked if she was all right. She simply nodded, her eyes never leaving Daniel, her strength radiating even through the pain. And then came the next twist, the one none of us could have predicted. My grandmother, instead of crying out or demanding he leave, spoke words that sent chills through the room. "I knew this day would come," she whispered, her voice steady, "and now the truth stands in the open for all to see." The weight of her words silenced the chaos for a moment. Daniel's face twisted, his eyes wild, and he turned toward me, as though searching for some sign of support. But all I could feel was betrayal, disgust, and a fear so deep it shook me to my core. My father moved between us, his protective stance making it clear that Daniel was no longer welcome here. My mother was already reaching for her phone, her hands trembling as she dialed, her voice breaking as she told the operator what had just happened. And that is when the reality sank in. Police were on their way. My fiancé was no longer the man I thought I knew, and this dinner, which was supposed to unite us, had torn everything apart. The silence after that shocking slap was heavier than thunder, and the clinking cutlery still rattling on the table felt like echoes in a courtroom. As though every eye in that dining room was a jury staring at the man who had just revealed his true nature. My grandmother's face, usually warm with kindness and light, now bore the mark of violence across her cheek, and my heart slammed against my chest as though trying to break free, demanding action, demanding justice. My fiancé stood tall, his chest heaving as though he was proud of what he had done, and that arrogance, that brazen display of dominance, made the entire atmosphere feel poisoned with tension that no one knew how to cut through. My uncle stood, his chair screeching across the floor like an alarm bell, but my fiancé only sneered, as though daring anyone to challenge him, and in that moment I realized the man I thought I loved was nothing more than a stranger wearing a mask that had finally cracked. My grandmother, steady despite the pain, did not cry, did not shout, did not crumble. She simply looked at me with eyes that asked a silent question. Was I strong enough to fight for her, or would I remain chained to this dangerous man? The guests were frozen, their forks suspended midair, their voices swallowed by fear, but the silence broke when my aunt gasped loudly, clutching her pearls as though the room itself had betrayed her, and that gasp turned into murmurs that grew like wildfire. My fiancé slammed his hand on the table, shattering a wine glass, and the red liquid bled across the white cloth like a warning of the destruction he was willing to cause if anyone dared defy him. Yet within me something stronger than fear began to rise, something that told me this night was not going to end the way he imagined. I took my grandmother's hand gently, lifting her from her chair as if to shield her from further harm, and the sight of me standing between them must have infuriated him. Further because his lips curled into a mocking smile, one that promised retaliation for my defiance. My father's voice finally cut through the chaos, firm and commanding, telling him to leave immediately, but he laughed, a cruel, bitter sound that echoed through the house, and he spat out words about how he was the future son-in-law and this family would eventually belong to him. The guests whispered in disbelief, their once celebratory evening turning into a courtroom of judgment and suspicion. But before anyone could rise again, my fiancé leaned forward, his voice low yet sharp, threatening that the police would not save us because he knew things, he had connections, and we would regret ever trying to shame him. The audacity of his words, the venom behind them, made me realize this was not just an outburst of temper. It was a declaration of war within the very walls of my family's home, and the battle lines were already being drawn. The air felt suffocating, as if every molecule inside that dining room carried the weight of betrayal, and though the chandelier above us still glittered with its artificial brilliance, the truth was that the light in my heart had already dimmed because the man I thought I would marry had turned into a monster before my very eyes. My grandmother, standing with her dignity intact despite the sting of his hand on her skin, squeezed my fingers gently, not as a sign of weakness but as a reminder of strength, and in that touch I understood that silence would no longer be a shield. I had to become the voice that defended her. My fiancé, unrepentant and smug, continued to spew venom about how weak families raised weak children, how traditions suffocated real progress, and how marrying me would give him the power to reshape everything according to his own twisted design, and each word felt like a dagger cutting away the illusion I had foolishly built around him. My father, whose authority rarely wavered, stood with clenched fists, but I could see in his eyes the conflict between defending his mother and keeping the peace for the sake of avoiding a scandal, and that hesitation was the opening my fiancé used to twist the knife deeper by claiming that my family needed him more than I needed them. The guests, sensing the poisonous undertones, began shifting uncomfortably in their seats, their earlier whispers transforming into louder ripples of outrage, but fear still pinned them to their chairs as though they were watching a play in which they dared not intervene, even as the scene turned darker by the minute. I finally raised my voice, cutting through the chaos with a steadiness I did not know I possessed, declaring that this engagement was finished, that the man who laid his hands on my grandmother would never again lay claim to me, and though the words tasted like iron in my mouth, they also burned with the purity of truth. For a moment, silence reclaimed the room, but then his laughter broke it apart again, the sound cruel, jagged, and haunting, and he promised that I would regret humiliating him publicly, that families like mine had skeletons hidden deep enough to bury me if I tried to expose him. My aunt cried out, begging me to reconsider. My cousins clutched each other as if a storm was about to swallow us whole, and my grandmother, still unflinching, raised her chin higher as though daring him to strike her again just so the mask of civility would fall completely. My fiancé's eyes narrowed, his voice dropped into a dangerous calm, and he revealed things no one expected. Secrets about business deals my father thought were hidden. Debts my uncle owed. Alliances that had been purchased with silence, and as each revelation fell like a bomb, the room erupted with disbelief and accusations that tore apart the very fabric of unity we once prided ourselves on. The dinner that was meant to celebrate love had mutated into a battlefield where trust crumbled and alliances shattered, and as relatives turned on each other with suspicion and anger, my fiancé smiled like a puppeteer satisfied with the chaos he orchestrated. I tried to speak, to reclaim control, but every time I opened my mouth he countered with another revelation, another betrayal that left someone else reeling, until it felt as though the walls themselves were trembling with the weight of family secrets dragged into the open. Yet amid the storm of voices and broken trust, my grandmother's steady hand on my arm grounded me again, reminding me that the truth, no matter how painful, was better than a life built on lies. And as I looked around at the faces of the people I loved, fractured by revelations but still standing, I knew the only way forward was to break free from his grip completely, even if it meant destroying everything I thought I wanted. The night had spiraled into chaos, but even as voices clashed and accusations flew like arrows, I realized there was still one truth that hadn't yet surfaced, one card that could silence my fiancé's poisonous laughter once and for all. And though my hands trembled, my voice carried the weight of generations when I announced that his threats meant nothing because I already knew his darkest secret. The smug look on his face faltered for the first time, the sharp edges of his arrogance softening into the twitch of fear, and the silence that fell across the room was so absolute that I could hear the pounding of my own heart echoing in my ears. My grandmother, steady as ever, gave me the smallest nod, as if she had always known I would rise in this moment, and I revealed that while he boasted of knowing every shadow in my family, I had evidence of the empire of lies he had built, of the companies he swindled, the charities he siphoned money from, and the forged contracts that would ruin him if they ever reached the wrong hands. Gasps erupted like thunder. Cousins covered their mouths in shock, and my father's conflicted eyes turned to me with a mixture of shame and pride, realizing that the daughter he once thought too quiet had become the one willing to speak what others were too afraid to say. My fiancé tried to laugh it off, to dismiss my words as empty threats, but before he could regain control, the heavy sound of boots echoed in the hallway and uniformed officers appeared at the entrance, their presence cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. His face drained of color, his body stiffened, and for the first time all night, the power slipped entirely from his hands, because the police were not there by coincidence. They had been watching him for months, and my words had given them the final push they needed to act. The guests, stunned into silence, watched as the man who had once paraded himself as untouchable was forced to stand, his wrists pulled behind his back, his voice cracking as he tried to protest his innocence. But his words no longer carried weight because the truth had already pierced through his carefully woven illusions, and my grandmother's lips curved into a faint, victorious smile, her dignity restored in the most poetic way imaginable, and though the family around us still reeled from betrayal and anger, in that moment unity returned, not in blind tradition, but in the shared relief of seeing evil unmasked. As the officers led him away, his eyes met mine one final time, no longer filled with arrogance but with desperation, a silent plea for mercy. But I gave him none because mercy belongs to those who stumble, not to those who trample others without remorse. The guests began to murmur again, this time with awe instead of fear, and though the night would forever be remembered as the evening our family's secrets spilled into the open, it would also be remembered as the night a granddaughter stood between cruelty and love, refusing to bow, refusing to break. When the doors closed behind him and the echo of his protests faded into nothingness, the chandelier's light seemed warmer, softer, and I finally breathed freely again, knowing that while scars would remain and trust would take years to rebuild, we had reclaimed something more important than reputation. We had reclaimed our dignity. My grandmother kissed my forehead softly, whispering that strength often skips a generation but always finds its way home, and in that embrace I understood that the future was no longer something I feared, but something I was ready to shape, not as a victim of betrayal but as the author of my own story.